From the moment we're born, we're taught to follow ready-made paths, to become what others expect of us, to chase what they say we should want, to live as if we're just pieces in a game we never chose to play. Most people spend their whole lives playing roles, wearing masks, and adjusting to others' expectations, without ever stopping to ask, who am I, really? Not what I do, not what I own, not what others think of me, but who I am, deep down, without pressure, without labels, without illusions. The great philosophers and thinkers noticed this human struggle centuries ago. Thinkers like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Jung, Sartre, Foucault, and many others dedicated themselves to understanding this emptiness and showing us the way to reclaim our true selves. They taught us that identity isn't something we're given. It's something we must build, face, and earn, and that without self-knowledge, there's no freedom, no authenticity, no real life. In this video, I've gathered 20 powerful philosophical ideas that will guide you on this journey back to yourself. Ideas that will challenge your beliefs, spark deep reflections, and, most importantly, help you see who you really are, beyond the masks and lies the world tries to impose on us. If you're tired of living on autopilot, if you feel like something's missing, if you know you can be more than what others expect of you, then this video is for you. Start today, the most important journey of your life, the journey to find your true self. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that the root of human suffering lies in a force he called the will, an irrational drive that compels us to desire, chase after things, and inevitably suffer. To him, the true self isn't the one caught up in the endless race for external achievements, but the one who manages to free itself from the grip of the will and, through that, finds inner peace. According to Schopenhauer, the will acts like an invisible chain. It's never satisfied. Even when we get what we want, a new desire quickly takes its place, starting a new cycle of longing and frustration. In this view, life becomes an endless series of sufferings, broken only by brief moments of relief, never by true happiness. Freeing yourself from the will means breaking that cycle. It's not about destroying every desire, but about recognizing how deceptive they are and no longer identifying with them. It's about understanding that constant wanting is a trap that keeps us restless and disconnected from the serenity that could reveal our deepest essence. Schopenhauer believed that practices like aesthetic contemplation, through art, music, and philosophy, offer rare moments where the will is suspended. When we are fully absorbed in the beauty of a work of art or the vastness of nature, we stop wanting something for ourselves. We simply exist, free, even if just for a moment, from the endless urge to want. These moments aren't just temporary escapes, they are glimpses of what it means to live beyond the will. Schopenhauer also saw compassion as one of the greatest ways to overcome the will. When we genuinely focus on the suffering of others, we break away from the constant focus on our own desires. Compassion dissolves the illusion of a separate self and connects us to a deeper dimension of existence. Freeing yourself from the will is ultimately an act of transcendence. It's about replacing agitation with acceptance, endless wanting with calm contemplation, and selfishness with genuine compassion. Only then can the true self, free from the invisible chains of desire, emerge in its most authentic and peaceful form. This is the key Schopenhauer offers. Don't seek happiness through satisfying your desires. Seek freedom from the very impulse to desire. Inner peace isn't something you achieve. It's something you find in the silent letting go of the inner struggle the will keeps alive. Accepting life exactly as it is, in all its beauty and brutality, was one of Friedrich Nietzsche's greatest teachings. For him, true human fulfillment doesn't come from running away from suffering, but from unconditionally accepting everything existence brings. Nietzsche called this attitude amor fati, the love of fate. Living amor fati means saying yes to everything, to joys and sorrows, triumphs and failures, lucky breaks and unexpected tragedies. It's about embracing the whole of life without regrets, without nostalgia, without resentment. Instead of wishing things had turned out differently, the person who practices amor fati learns to see every event, even the painful ones, as a necessary part of their journey of becoming. Nietzsche saw this attitude as true creative power, fully accepting life without trying to bend it to our fragile expectations, frees us from being reactive and bitter. Instead of being prisoners of what could have been, we become the authors of our own meaning. Amor fati turns obstacles into raw material for growth and suffering into fuel for creation. This active acceptance isn't passive resignation. On the contrary, it's an act of courage. It's easy to love life when everything's going well. The real challenge is to keep loving it through pain, loss, and failure. Nietzsche doesn't ask us to love only the pleasant parts. He challenges us to love also what tests and shapes us. Loving fate is a deep act of inner strength, a radical affirmation of existence itself. By practicing amor fati, we let go of guilt and unrealistic ideals. We stop searching for justifications for what happened or for who we are. Instead, we find power in simply being. This love for what is real brings us closer to a more authentic and vibrant life, where existence isn't a problem to be solved, but a work of art to be created. Nietzsche invites us to live in such a way that we would wish for our life, with all its moments, to be lived over and over again for eternity. That's the true measure of amor fati. To want the eternal return of what we have lived. To love fate is, ultimately, to love yourself, your life, and the world. Not as you wish they were, but exactly as they are, in their raw and magnificent truth. In building our identity, there's an invisible tension between who we truly are and who we appear to be. Carl Gustav Jung called this social facade the persona, the mask we wear to adapt to the world's expectations. The persona is necessary. It allows us to function in society, protects us, and helps us navigate relationships. But when we mistake this mask for our true self, we move away from what Jung called the self, the deepest, most authentic core of our existence. The persona is born from collective archetypes, the images and roles we inherit from culture, education, and human history. Being the good son, the successful professional, or the reliable friend are examples of roles society offers us. By adopting these masks, we gain acceptance, recognition, and a sense of security. But there's a price. We lose spontaneity and drift away from our own inner depths. Jung didn't condemn the persona. He recognized its usefulness. The real problem begins when we completely identify with it. When we live only to meet others' expectations, we suffocate our individuality, repress our most genuine desires, and create deep internal conflict. The soul, ignored for too long, starts to show its distress through symptoms of anxiety, emptiness, or deep dissatisfaction. The path to the authentic self requires courage to distinguish between what is mask and what is essence. Jung proposed that the process of individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are, involves confronting the persona, questioning it, and integrating the forgotten parts of ourselves. It's not about destroying the mask, but about wearing it consciously, without letting it define our entire identity. As we dive into this process, we discover not only our light, but also our shadows, impulses, emotions, and talents we've suppressed to fit in. Facing these hidden parts takes maturity, but it's the key to living a more truthful and fulfilling life. The self, for Jung, isn't some moral ideal. It's a living, dynamic whole, a center striving for harmony between our inner and outer realities. Living aligned with the self means letting go of the fear of judgment and embracing the full complexity of who we are. It's about recognizing that we are many things and still uniquely ourselves. By integrating persona and self, we stop being prisoners of our social images and become conscious authors of our own story. How many masks have you been wearing without even realizing it? Which parts of you are still waiting to be seen? For Jean-Paul Sartre, we are not born ready. There is no given essence that defines who we are. Instead, we are a project in constant construction, shaped by the choices we make at every moment. At the core of Sartre's existentialism is the idea that existence precedes essence. We first exist, and only through our actions do we create what we become. This radical freedom may seem liberating, but it's also a heavy burden. Sartre said we are condemned to be free because there's no escaping responsibility for the choices we make. We can't blame nature, society, or education for what we are. We are, essentially, the result of our actions, and also of the actions we fail to take. Living as a project means accepting that we are constantly sculpting our identity. Every decision, big or small, is a step toward who we choose to be. There is no fixed path or instruction manual. There's no inner truth waiting to be discovered, but rather a living work being built through the intertwining of choices, sacrifices, and creations. Sartre rejected the idea that humans could rely on absolute values or unchanging essences. For him, it's in the real world, faced with concrete situations, that we reveal who we are. Choosing is how we define ourselves, and even the refusal to choose is paradoxically a choice in itself. This view breaks away from the comforting idea of destiny. There is no predetermined role for each person. Everyone is the author of their own existence, even though we often try to hide from this freedom by adopting ready-made roles, manufactured identities, or others' expectations. Sartre called this escape from responsibility bad faith, a form of lying to oneself, denying the very freedom to be. Building yourself as a project requires authenticity. It requires looking at your own freedom seriously and recognizing that in the end, we are responsible not only for what we do, but for who we are. There are no excuses, no easy salvation. There is only the continuous choice to become. The self, in this view, is an open adventure, always unfinished. Every moment offers the possibility to reaffirm or transform who we are. And you, what kind of project of yourself have you been building? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's reflect together on the freedom and responsibility of being the authors of our own story. The inscription, "Know thyself," engraved on the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, became the central motto of Socrates and Western philosophy. For him, self-knowledge wasn't just another virtue, but the starting point for all truly human life. Without self-awareness, there's no wisdom, no happiness, no solid ethics. The individual must first turn their gaze inward. Socrates understood that many people live like sleepwalkers. They act, speak, and make decisions, but never ask themselves who they really are or what they truly want. In his conversations, the famous Socratic dialogues, he challenged his listeners to question their most basic beliefs, not because he had all the answers, but because he believed that unrecognized ignorance was the greatest prison of the soul. Know thyself is a call to radical honesty. It means admitting one's limitations, biases, and contradictions, but it's also a call to discover one's strengths, talents, and untapped potential. For Socrates, self-knowledge isn't an end in itself. It's the foundation upon which a life of virtue and authenticity can be built. However, self-knowledge is not an easy or comfortable task. Often, we prefer to hide behind social masks or inherited ideas because looking inward may force us to confront doubts, fears, and weaknesses. By proposing the constant examination of life, Socrates knew this could be unsettling, and in fact, it troubled so many that he was eventually sentenced to death. True Socratic self-knowledge isn't simply accumulating information about yourself, like personality traits or superficial preferences. It's a deep investigation into what is just, beautiful, and true, and how those values are reflected in our concrete actions. For Socrates, living without seeking this clarity was living automatically, alienated from one's true essence. Adopting know thyself as a principle of life is committing to a more lucid and responsible existence. It's understanding that true strength doesn't come from always being right, but from the ability to question yourself and grow from it. And you, how much have you allowed yourself to look inward? For Epictetus, one of the great masters of Stoicism, freedom and serenity begin the moment we understand the difference between what is within our control and what is not. More than that, living fully requires aligning our actions with our inner nature without allowing ourselves to be enslaved by the whims of the outside world. Epictetus's philosophy is deeply practical. He reminds us that we don't control fortune, other people's opinions, political events, or even our own body in the end. What truly lies within our control are our choices, our judgments, and our attitude toward life. Wisdom, then, is about investing energy only in what depends on us. Living according to one's nature is, above all, recognizing our condition as rational and moral beings. Our nature is not to be dominated by unchecked desires, fears, or ambitions. Our true essence is our ability to discern, to act with justice, to seek good and truth, no matter the external circumstances. Epictetus viewed acceptance not as passive and resignation, but as an expression of inner strength. Accepting what cannot be changed is a way to free ourselves from anxiety, frustration, and useless anger. It's not about being indifferent to life, but about acting wisely within the limits of reality. Stoicism teaches us that true peace doesn't depend on changing the world around us, but on adjusting our perspective of it. When we try to change what is beyond our reach, we suffer. But when we calmly accept what escapes our control and focus on acting with virtue where we can, we find the inner harmony that so many seek in vain. Epictetus invites us, therefore, to a life of authenticity and true freedom. Not the illusory freedom of doing whatever we want, but the solid freedom of living in alignment with who we truly are. How many times have we lost our peace trying to control what was never in our hands? For Baruch Spinoza, understanding who we are means recognizing that we are not isolated entities, but expressions of a single infinite reality, nature or God. Our true self, according to him, is not limited to the small ego that insists on seeing itself as separate, unique, and absolute. Finding oneself is about dissolving this illusion and realizing that we are modes of an eternal substance that manifests in everything that exists. Spinoza breaks with the traditional idea of a sovereign self, disconnected from the world. For him, human existence is an organic part of the totality of nature, just as a wave is an inseparable part of the ocean. To think that we are independent is to fall into an illusion that generates suffering, conflict, and frustration. Wisdom begins the moment we recognize that everything we are, our thoughts, our bodies, our feelings, is merely a temporary expression of the whole. This perspective completely transforms the way we deal with our emotions, ambitions, and fears. When we realize that we are part of the natural whole, we understand that things don't happen against us. They simply follow the laws of reality, of which we are also an expression. Anger, envy, vanity, all these emotions lose their power when we become aware of the unity. Spinoza believed that this understanding does not lead to passivity, but to a serene joy, to a higher form of freedom. To free oneself from the ego does not mean to nullify oneself, but to recognize oneself as part of something infinitely greater, wisely accepting our place in the natural order. True human power, for Spinoza, is the power to understand, and through understanding, to love reality as it is. Living this conscious dissolution of the ego brings us closer to what Spinoza called the intellectual love of God, a love not directed toward an external entity, but toward the very being of existence. In this love, we do not feel diminished, but uplifted, because we recognize that everything necessary, eternal, and true also pulses within us. By dissolving the illusion of separation, we find a peace that does not depend on external conditions, because we know that we belong, we have always belonged, to the infinite order of life. Sigmund Freud revolutionized the way we understand the human mind by revealing that much of who we are is beyond our conscious awareness. For Freud, we are not the absolute masters of our own thoughts. We are largely driven by desires, impulses, and memories that remain hidden in the unconscious. Repression is the central mechanism that explains why certain thoughts remain hidden. Freud observed that not everything we feel or desire is acceptable to our conscious mind, especially when it comes to the social and moral norms we've internalized since childhood. To avoid internal conflict and discomfort, the mind represses these thoughts, pushing them into the unconscious. But they don't disappear. They continue to act silently, influencing our behaviors, our emotions, and even our physical symptoms. Ignoring. The unconscious is living divided. Often we act in ways we don't understand, make decisions that go against our apparent logic, self-sabotage, or carry around anxiety without an obvious cause. These are all manifestations of what Freud called the return of the repressed, things we try to exclude from our conscious mind that return disguised, whether in dreams, slips of the tongue, or inexplicable impulses. Self-knowledge, for Freud, inevitably involves exploring the unconscious. It's not enough to examine our conscious thoughts. We need to dig deeper through dream analysis, free association, and interpreting slips of the tongue. Only by bringing to light what has been repressed can we heal internal wounds and fully integrate our personality. Recognizing the role of repression doesn't mean justifying destructive behaviors, but understanding where they come from. It's about accepting that within us are conflicting forces, desires that challenge us, and fears we prefer not to face. This radical honesty with oneself is, for Freud, the first step toward a freer, more conscious life. Denying the unconscious is perpetuating inner slavery. Accepting it, on the other hand, is opening the door to profound transformation. By facing our own shadows, we stop being at the mercy of hidden impulses and start living in a way that's more authentic and closer to who we truly are. How many of your behaviors have you tried to understand but couldn't find an explanation? 4. Share in the comments if you've ever had an experience where you felt something deeper was guiding your choices. Let's reflect together on the mysteries of the mind. For Simone de Beauvoir, human life is, above all, an open project. We are not defined by a fixed essence or a predetermined destiny. We are freedom, and it is through the exercise of this freedom that we create who we are. Each choice, for Beauvoir, carries an ethical weight. When we decide what to do with our existence, we take responsibility for creating meaning in a world that, on its own, is neutral. Freedom, in this context, is not an easy privilege. It's a burden and a challenge, because being free inevitably means being responsible, not only for what we choose to be, but also for the consequences our choices have on others. We do not exist in isolation. Our projects intersect with and affect the shared world. Beauvoir emphasizes that denying this freedom, trying to hide behind ready-made roles, blindly accepted traditions, or imposed norms, is a form of bad faith, an attempt to escape the existential weight of choice. But this escape is illusory. Even omission is a choice. There is no neutrality when it comes to building one's own being. Choosing a project for life, for Beauvoir, is an ethical act because it involves recognizing our own freedom and the freedom of others. It's not enough to seek personal fulfillment, selfishly. We must consider how our projects contribute, or harm, everyone else's freedom. The existentialist ethics she proposes doesn't impose fixed rules. It demands that every action be evaluated based on the freedom it promotes. This vision requires maturity and courage. There are no absolute guarantees. There are no ready-made formulas for an authentic life. There's only the constant risk of deciding, committing, and acting, even knowing that the world is uncertain and that the meaning of existence depends on our ongoing creation. Building oneself as a project is about affirming that life is not something simply received. It's something invented. It's understanding that we are not born with an instruction manual, but that every conscious step is a declaration of who we are becoming. Simone de Beauvoir reminds us that freedom is beautiful precisely because it is unstable and challenging. We are free to make ourselves, but this freedom demands the courage to be the authors of our own story. Michel Foucault revived a powerful idea from ancient philosophy, the notion that taking care of oneself is a fundamental ethical practice. But for Foucault, the care of the self is not simply a quest for superficial well-being or self-esteem. It's a rigorous and creative work on oneself, a true art of living, where existence is shaped as if it were a work of art. In Foucault's view, the self is not something given and unchangeable. On the contrary, we are beings in constant formation, and we have the power and the responsibility to transform ourselves. This process doesn't happen by chance. It requires discipline, critical awareness, and an active attitude toward oneself. The care of the self is, therefore, a commitment to self-construction that runs through every aspect of life, the way we think, feel, relate, and act in the world. For Foucault, taking care of oneself is also about resistance. It's about resisting the blindly imposed norms, the manufactured truths that try to define who we should be. The care of the self means developing the ability to think for oneself, to choose how one wants to live, and to take responsibility for that choice. It's not about empty rebellion, but about an autonomy earned through self-knowledge and the constant practice of sculpting oneself as a free being. This ethical practice transforms everyday life into a space of creation. Every gesture, every choice, every word can be a conscious expression of the kind of life we want to build. Foucault saw ancient philosophy, especially Stoics and Epicureans, as examples of how the care of the self involved spiritual exercises, daily reflections, and the construction of a stance toward existence. Taking care of oneself, then, is not about isolating oneself from the world, but about positioning oneself in it in a lucid and authentic way. It's about accepting that living is a difficult art, and that, like all art, it requires practice, patience, and above all, intention. In today's world, where we are so often shaped by external forces, standards of success, beauty, and behavior, Foucault's proposal seems more urgent than ever: to become the author of one's own existence, to live in such a way that life, in the end, can be seen as a unique creation, the result of conscious choices. And for you, what does it mean to take care of yourself amidst the pressures of everyday life? Friedrich Nietzsche believed that true human greatness lies in the ability to overcome oneself. For him, it's not enough to live by repeating inherited values, social conventions, or ready-made beliefs. The authentic human being is the one who dares to break free from what has been imposed on them, creating new paths, new values, and a new way of existing. At the heart of this philosophy is the idea of eternal recurrence, the hypothesis that everything we live through will repeat itself infinitely, exactly the same way. Nietzsche proposes that we should live as if every act, every choice, every thought must be repeated forever. The question he asks us is direct and unsettling. If you had to live this life, exactly as it is, countless times, would you want to? This challenge is not meant to plunge us into despair, but to push us toward a life of maximum responsibility and maximum value. Accepting the eternal recurrence is affirming life in its entirety, with its pains and joys, its mistakes and triumphs. It's a call to overcome oneself, to live in such a way that we can say yes to the repetition of our existence. For Nietzsche, overcoming oneself also means creating. We cannot simply accept ready-made values, inherited from tradition, religion, or the morality of the herd. We need to, from the recognition of the death of God, that is the absence of pre-given absolute values, create our own values. This is the work of the free spirit. the one who, aware of their freedom, is able to give meaning to their own life. This creation of new values is not an act of whim. It requires depth, courage, and above all, loyalty to oneself. It's a reconstruction, born from facing the void and the will to affirm existence with all its contradictions. Nietzsche teaches us that a worthy life is one in constant process of elevation. We don't become who we are all at once. We are always becoming, always overcoming ourselves, always pushing beyond our own limits. And you, are you creating a life that you would embrace forever? Jean-Paul Sartre captured one of the deepest conflicts of human existence: the tension between being for oneself and being for others. In his existential philosophy, he showed how individual freedom never exists in complete isolation. We are always in relation, looked at, judged, interpreted, and, inevitably, this shapes the way we perceive ourselves. For Sartre, being for itself is the radical freedom to create ourselves through our choices. It's the awareness that we are an open project, with no fixed essence, constantly in motion, creating ourselves with every decision. In essence, we are freedom in action. However, living in society, we face the gaze of the other. When we are seen, we stop being only subjects and become objects in the perception of others. We are the exemplary student, the reliable friend, the competent professional, images formed by the judgments of others. And inevitably, we begin to see ourselves through these eyes. This process creates an internal conflict. We want to be free, but we also desire recognition. We seek to affirm our existence through the gaze of others, but in doing so, we risk imprisoning ourselves in roles we didn't freely choose. Sartre called this tension bad faith, when we surrender to the view of the other and stop asserting ourselves as authentic projects. The challenge, then, is to find a balance between being for oneself and being for the other. We cannot completely free ourselves from social influence. After all, we are beings in the world, among other beings, but we can choose not to be defined solely by it. We can accept the gaze of others without reducing ourselves to it, while keeping the awareness of our original freedom. Sartre invites us to recognize that, even in the face of external judgments, we are always free to interpret, resist, and create our own narrative. The gaze of the other is inevitable, but submission to it is not. Being authentic is living with this tension without fleeing from it, staying true to the freedom that defines our essence. Life, according to Sartre, is this constant struggle between the desire to be fully free and the reality of being seen and shaped. It is in the awareness of this tension, and in the continuous choice to assert ourselves despite it, that our existence gains depth and authenticity. Arthur Schopenhauer saw human life as a constant battleground against the blind will that drives us to desire, achieve, and suffer. For him, as long as we are trapped in this cycle of wanting, we will inevitably remain far from our deepest essence. True liberation, according to Schopenhauer, comes through the conscious renunciation of desires, a radical act of rejecting the illusion that keeps us captive. The will, in his philosophy, is an irrational and relentless force. We don't desire. Just once, we always desire. Achieving one goal only creates a new desire, a new emptiness to be filled. In this scenario, happiness always seems delayed, always conditioned on something still to come. Schopenhauer saw this as the great tragedy of human existence. Renunciation does not mean despising life or falling into sterile nihilism. On the contrary, it is the clear choice to no longer be a slave to this dynamic of endless desires. It is realizing that, by consciously denying the will, we create space for an inner peace that the external world could never offer us. This act of denial is not forced or born from bitterness. It arises from the maturation of consciousness, the clear realization that the path to happiness based on desires is illusory. It is like a weary traveler who, after walking many fruitless paths, finally understands that true peace is not at the final destination, but in abandoning the race. Schopenhauer deeply admired examples of renunciation found in spiritual traditions, like Buddhism and early Christianity, where the individual does not seek to assert themselves through the world, but transcends the world by overcoming their untamed passions internally. For him, renouncing is an act of strength, not weakness. It is the pinnacle of human freedom. The ability to say no to the tyranny of the will, and in doing so, touch the silent essence that exists beyond wanting and suffering. By practicing conscious renunciation, we do not become indifferent to life. Paradoxically, we become more alive. Freed from the turmoil of endless desires, we begin to perceive the serene beauty of existence, just as it is, without demanding that it conform to our wants. Carl Gustav Jung expanded the understanding of the human psyche by introducing the idea of the collective unconscious, a vast reservoir of images, symbols, and inherited experiences that go beyond each person's individual history. According to Jung, finding the true self is not just a process of personal self-knowledge, but also of reconnecting with this deeper and more universal dimension that lives within us. The collective unconscious is inhabited by archetypes, primordial, figures like the hero, the wise one, the shadow, the great mother. These images are not individual inventions, but ancient patterns that shape the way we feel, think, and dream, often without us realizing it. They are the invisible fabric that connects all human beings in a shared experience of humanity. The inner journey proposed by Jung requires the courage to descend into our own depths and discover these archetypes acting silently. Denying or ignoring them is to move away from wholeness. Integrating them is to move toward the self, the unifying center of the personality. This process of integration, called individuation by Jung, is the task of a lifetime. Along this path, we are called to recognize not only our light, but also our shadows, those repressed, unknown, or feared aspects that are part of who we are. The shadow, for example, is a fundamental archetype that, if not confronted, tends to manifest in unconscious and destructive behaviors. Integrating it is essential for psychic maturity. Jung saw the inner journey as a symbolic crossing. Dreams, myths, art, and spiritual experiences are maps that point to this dive into the collective unconscious. They reveal dimensions of the soul that rational thought alone cannot access. It's not about abandoning reason, but making space for a deep dialogue with the ancestral wisdom that resides in every being. Finding the self, therefore, is not about building an idealized identity. It's about reconciling the inner multiplicity, accepting the complexity of being human in its entirety. It's about becoming whole, not perfect. This journey, though personal, is also universal. By exploring the collective unconscious, we touch something greater than ourselves, a living heritage that connects us to all those who came before and to all those who will come after. In the letters he wrote to Lucilius, Seneca offers a lesson that has stood the test of time. It is through detachment that we rediscover the truest part of ourselves. As long as we let ourselves be dragged by uncontrolled passions, by the insatiable thirst for wealth, power, and status, we will always be distant from who we really are, captives of forces we cannot control. Stoicism teaches that much of human suffering comes from confusing what is within our power and what is not. Desiring what is beyond our control is to plant the seed of frustration. Seneca invites us to reverse this logic, to cultivate only what depends on us, our thoughts, our actions, our moral integrity. Detachment does not mean rejecting life, but living it with inner freedom. We can own things, enjoy friendships, and take on roles in the world, but we should never allow these things to own us. The true measure of our worth is our ability to remain serene when fate takes away what it once gave. For Seneca, detachment is inseparable from reason and virtue. Uncontrolled passion clouds judgment and makes us vulnerable to the whims of fate. Reason, on the other hand, lights the way to tranquility. It teaches us that true wealth is being enough in ourselves, that true power is governing ourselves, and that true glory is living in harmony with nature and wisdom. Reconnecting with the true self in this philosophy is an internal cleansing process. It's like polishing a mirror clouded by illusions. When we free ourselves from the fear of loss and unrestrained desire, what remains is the clarity, strength, and peace that have been within us from the beginning. Seneca knew that the external world is volatile. Fortune, health, recognition, everything can change in an instant. The only secure fortress is the one built inside us. Detachment does not make us cold, but resilient. It does not make us indifferent, but wise. If we want to live a full life, we must learn to love what is lasting. Virtue, integrity, and the peace that comes from calmly accepting what fate brings. Nothing remains the same. Everything flows. This is the essence of Heraclitus's thought, the Greek philosopher who saw in the constant movement of reality the key to understanding existence, including our own identity. For him, the true self is not something fixed or unchangeable. We are, in fact, a continuous flow, always in transformation. Heraclitus used the image of a river to illustrate this truth. You can never cross the same river twice. The same is true for us. At every moment, thoughts change, emotions arise and disappear, choices reshape us. Identity is not a solid stone. It is a living current, shaped by experience and time. This view frees us from the trap of searching for a final essence, an idealized version of ourselves that would be found and kept forever. We are not finished projects waiting to be discovered. We are processes, beings who are constantly remaking ourselves, whether through our own decisions or through the circumstances of life. Accepting the flow means accepting that change is not a sign of weakness or inconsistency, but part of the very nature of existence. Resisting this is a source of suffering. How many times have we tried to hold on to old versions of who we were, or outdated ideas about who we should be? Heraclitus reminds us that living is about embracing transformation without fear. The challenge is to stay conscious of this process, to realize that although we change, there is a thread of continuity, a unique style of change, a personal way of crossing the river of life. Authenticity, in this sense, is not about always being the same, but about transforming in a way that stays true to the deepest experiences that pass through us. Heraclitus did not see this as a threat, but as a source of wisdom. The one who understands that everything flows learns to be flexible in the face of loss, open to new things, and calm during crises. Instead of fighting against impermanence, we can dance with it, recognizing it as a constant opportunity for renewal. Therefore, our true self is not something hidden somewhere in the past, but something that is built, lived, and invented moment by moment. And you, how have you been dealing with the inevitable changes of life? In a world that values masks, speed, and distractions, Martin Heidegger invites us to a radical movement, the unveiling of being. For him, authenticity does not come from external achievements or social image, but from the courageous act of facing our own existence seriously, especially our finitude. Heidegger observes that most of the time we live immersed in what he called inauthentic everydayness, a state where we follow routines, repeat pre-made speeches, and get lost in the anonymous. That is what is done, what is said, what is expected. But there are moments when this fog clears, moments when anguish erupts and forces us to face a brutal truth. We are beings towards death. This existential anguish is not simply a fear of dying, but the deep realization that our existence is limited and therefore deeply meaningful. When anguish strikes, all superficial certainties lose their meaning. We stand before the nothingness, and it is right there that the possibility of authenticity opens up. The unveiling of being happens when we stop running from this condition and, instead, fully embrace it. Accepting finitude does not mean falling into despair. It means living each moment as unique and irreplaceable. It means acting not because one must, but because we choose to, because we take full responsibility for our existence. Heidegger teaches that to be authentic is to live facing our own being, aware of its precariousness, and still affirming this life with intensity. It is not about dramatizing death, but letting the awareness of it illuminate life, freeing us from empty distractions and guiding us to make more genuine choices. By confronting anguish and embracing finitude, we become capable of living more fully, more grounded. We begin to act from within ourselves rather than by external pressures. Each action then becomes an expression of the being we choose to be, in the face of the finite time we are given. The unveiling of being is not a magical, definitive moment. It is a continuous stance, an inner vigilance to avoid getting lost in the flow of triviality. And you? How have you dealt with the awareness of finitude in your own life? Leave your comment. Let's reflect together on how anguish, instead of paralyzing us, can lead us to a more authentic and meaningful existence. David Hume broke with one of the deepest beliefs in Western philosophy, the idea that there is a continuous and substantial self, a solid identity that persists over time. For him, this notion is nothing but a myth. What we call the self is not a permanent entity, but a collection of perceptions, a sequence of sensations, emotions, memories, and thoughts that follow one another like disconnected scenes in a movie. When we search within ourselves for something fixed and unchanging, what do we find? Only impressions that change without end. Joy, pain, hope, fear. Each feeling and idea arises, shines for a moment, and then dissolves, making way for others. There is no self holding them together outside of this flow. There is only the flow itself. Hume compared the mind to a theatre where various perceptions parade, but where there is no stage or fixed actor behind the scenes. The continuity we feel is, in fact, an illusion created by memory and the association of ideas. What seems like a single thread of identity is just the improvised stitching of distinct moments. This radical view deconstructs the belief in the rational unity of the self. If there is no solid self, then there is no absolute center of control that governs all actions. We are, in a way, fragments in motion, influenced by internal and external forces that escape the idea of a sovereign reason. However, far from leading to despair, this perspective opens up space for a more humble and flexible way of existing. If we are not prisoners of a rigid essence, we also have the freedom to reinvent ourselves at every moment. The fluidity of the self becomes an opportunity for growth, adaptation, and continuous transformation. Hume teaches us that perhaps the mistake lies in seeking security in a fixed identity. Accepting the self as a process, rather than as a substance, is to live with greater openness to change, to the plurality that inhabits us, and to the impermanence that marks every experience. And you, have you ever felt that your identity has changed over the course of your life in ways you couldn't have predicted? In the contemporary world, amidst an almost infinite variety of identities and lifestyles, Charles Taylor points to authenticity as one of the most central and most challenging values of human existence. For him, being authentic is not simply about being different or following your own taste, but making a deep commitment to what truly gives meaning to our lives. Taylor understands that modernity has brought an explosion of possibilities. We can be many things, adopt different ways of living, and express ourselves in countless ways. However, this freedom, if not grounded in something solid, can throw us into a sea of superficiality. Instead of real freedom, we can fall into the trap of shaping ourselves based only on what's trendy, convenient, or socially validated. Authenticity, according to Taylor, requires honest inner listening. It means recognizing that we are not a blank slate, but that we are born into historical, cultural, and familial contexts that shape us. Being authentic, then, is not about denying these influences, but about engaging with them, consciously, choosing which values and meanings genuinely resonate with the person we want to be. This quest is neither easy nor comfortable. In an era where the pressure to be socially accepted is constant, staying true to oneself takes courage. Authenticity requires resisting the temptation to live only to please, fit in, or seek approval. It's a continuous process of discernment and reaffirmation of what is essential for each of us. Taylor criticizes the caricatured view that reduces authenticity to mere narcissistic individualism. Being authentic is not about ignoring others or closing yourself off in your own world. On the contrary, it's about positioning yourself in dialogue with society, contributing to it from a conscious and well-formed identity. True authenticity recognizes that we only find full meaning in relation to other human beings. Therefore, authenticity is not just a personal value, it's also an ethical and social value. When we strive to be true to ourselves, we also enrich the world around us by offering something genuine, instead of reproducing empty masks and expectations. In times of noise and distraction, finding and affirming your true self is an act of resistance and creation. In a system where work is reduced to mere survival and human relationships are mediated by economic interests, Karl Marx identified one of the central dramas of modern existence: the alienation of the true self. For him, alienation is not just a psychological feeling of disconnection. It is a concrete reality rooted in the material conditions of life. Marx saw human beings as inherently creative, meant to transform the world with their free and conscious labor. However, in capitalist societies, work loses this expressive nature. The worker no longer identifies with what they produce, because what they create is taken by others. And the process of work itself becomes a forced activity, empty of meaning. The result is that the human being becomes distant from their own essence. Instead of realizing themselves through creation, they become fragmented. They feel alienated from the product of their work, from others, from nature, and even from themselves. Alienation, then, is a loss of self that quietly happens in everyday life. This condition is not limited to the workplace. Marx showed that alienation permeates all social spheres, shaping our desires, relationships, and perceptions. We live in a world where the value of being is replaced by the value of exchange, where human relationships are mediated by the market, and where true individuality is replaced by pre-made social roles. Recovering the true self, according to Marx, would not be possible just through internal changes or personal goodwill. It requires a concrete transformation of life's conditions, a new way of organizing society where labor regains its free, creative, and communal character. The Marxist project is therefore deeply ethical. It is about reclaiming the lost humanity. It is about creating a society where people no longer have to alienate themselves to survive, but can fully express themselves in their activities, relationships, and in the way they integrate with nature. When Marx speaks of alienation, he is not only making an economic critique, he is making an existential call for us to reclaim what truly makes us human. In his book, The Birth of Tragedy, Friedrich Nietzsche presents a powerful view of human existence as a field of tension between two fundamental forces, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. More than artistic concepts, these principles represent deep dimensions of being. On one side, order, rationality, and form. On the other, instinct, passion, and the dissolution of boundaries. Apollo symbolizes the drive to create clear structures, to make sense of things, to seek harmonious beauty and measure. It is the force that builds identities, that draws safe boundaries in the midst of chaos. Dionysus, on the other hand, embodies ecstasy, the surrender to the irrational, the merging of the individual with the totality of life. It is the force that breaks boundaries, that dissolves the self into something greater, primal, and vibrant. Nietzsche believed that the formation of the authentic self depends on the creative tension between these two forces. It is not about choosing between Apollo and Dionysus, but about finding a dynamic balance between them. When we focus only on the Apollonian, life becomes rigid, artificial, suffocated by rules and conventions. When we surrender only to the Dionysian, we risk losing ourselves in chaos and destruction. For Nietzsche, the true strength of humanity emerges from the ability to unite these opposites within oneself. It requires the clarity of reason to shape life, but also the intensity of instinct to keep existence full of vitality and authenticity. The tragic art of the ancient Greeks, Nietzsche's great inspiration, was born exactly from this synthesis, where the beautiful and the terrible coexisted in living harmony. In the construction of the self, this inner struggle manifests in our daily decisions, between the need for stability and the desire for rupture, between safe logic and risky passion, between creating meaning and surrendering to pure experience. Ignoring one side is to mutilate the soul itself. Nietzsche invites us to embrace this struggle, to not fear the inner conflict. To be whole is to accept that we are made of light and shadow, measure and excess, form and impulse. Human greatness is born from this tense and creative dance. For Arthur Schopenhauer, what we call reality is largely a construction of our mind, a representation, not the thing itself. We live trapped in an illusion. We believe that the world we see, touch, and interpret is the ultimate reality. However, according to him, to find the true self, we must go beyond this appearance and break through the veil of representation. In his work, The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer states that the world we experience is filtered through our senses and the mental structure that organizes these impressions. Time, space, causality, all of these do not belong to things in themselves, but are modes of perception created by our intellect. What we access, therefore, is not the essence of the real, but only a constructed image. This perception creates a subtle prison. We take what is a representation and treat it as if it were the full reality. We desire objects, fight for status, seek external rewards, believing that they hold the meaning of existence. But all of this is merely a reflection, a surface. When we cling to representation, we forget who we really are. Schopenhauer proposes that the essence of being, the will, lies behind the phenomenal world. The will is an irrational, blind, and ceaseless force that manifests in all beings, and also in us. Recognizing this deeper dimension involves abandoning the naive belief that the objective world, as we perceive it, is the ultimate truth. Overcoming the illusion of representation requires a kind of awakening. It is necessary to turn inward, question the reality of the images that seduce and imprison us. This process of disillusionment is painful, but also liberating. It allows us to access a more authentic experience of existence, where the self is not defined by social masks, possessions, or roles we play. Schopenhauer points out that aesthetic contemplation and compassion are privileged paths to transcending representation. Art allows us to intuit something beyond appearance, and compassion breaks the illusion of separateness, revealing the essential unity of all beings. Breaking with the illusory representation is, therefore, reconnecting with the silent core of being, that which exists independently of the transient forms the world presents to us. For Jean-Paul Sartre, freedom is not a choice between several ready-made options. It is a fundamental condition of human existence, and paradoxically, an inevitable burden. When he says, "Man is condemned to be free," Sartre points to an unsettling truth. We cannot escape the responsibility of creating, at every moment, who we are. We are not like objects with a fixed essence. A clock, a chair, a stone, they all have a determined function and meaning. But human beings, before being anything, simply exist, and by existing, we are free to invent ourselves. There is no predestined nature or written script. Every choice, every action, every silence builds the life project we carry. this radical freedom is both a blessing and a weight. We are the authors of our own identity, but we cannot transfer this task to anyone else. We cannot blame others, circumstances, or fate. Even in extreme situations, Sartre would say, we still choose. We choose how to react, how to interpret, how to resist or surrender. Living with this perspective requires courage. Freedom offers no guarantees. There is no essence waiting to be discovered, nor an ideal version of ourselves ready to be reached. There is only the open field of existence, and within it, the need to continuously choose who we want to be, knowing that this choice rests entirely on us. The condemnation to freedom also breaks with the idea that there are universal answers for how to live. Sartre criticizes any attempt to seek absolute foundations in morality, religion, or tradition. Instead, he proposes that each individual be the creator of their own values, aware that their choices not only shape their own life, but also project an image of what they believe a human being should be. Responsibility, therefore, is immense. Choosing is not just an individual act, it is a commitment to all of humanity. There is no escaping this weight, and it is this awareness that can lead us to authenticity or despair. Accepting freedom means accepting that we are always under construction, always at risk, always facing the need to reinvent ourselves. And you, how have you lived your freedom? As an unbearable burden or as an opportunity for creation? Share in the comments. Let's think together about this fascinating and sometimes scary adventure of being free. Paul Ricoeur brought to philosophy a sensitive and powerful view on the construction of identity. We become who we are through the stories we tell about our own lives. The self, far from being a fixed substance, is for him a narrative fiction, a work we compose over time, made of memories, interpretations, and projects. According to Ricoeur, our identity is not something we simply discover as a hidden truth. It is actively created, shaped by the narratives that structure our experience. Every time we tell who we are, to ourselves or to others, we select events, give meaning to occurrences, and connect scattered moments into a continuous story. Without this ability to narrate, our life would be just a chaotic sequence of isolated facts. This understanding does not diminish the reality of the self. On the contrary, it shows that our identity is alive, open, and constantly changing. We are authors, not just characters, of the stories that make us. We can reinterpret the past, rewrite the present, imagine possible futures, and through this, change the way we understand ourselves. Ricoeur also warns that the narrative is not a solitary process. We tell our stories in dialogue with the world, influenced by cultural traditions, social values, and the relationships that shape our existence. While we are authors, we are also readers and listeners of the stories society proposes to us. Personal narrative, then, becomes a space of mediation between the individual and the collective, between freedom and responsibility. We don't invent our story out of nothing. We interpret a concrete life made of limits, encounters, choices, and losses. Recognizing the self as a narrative fiction is to embrace the complexity of human existence. It is understanding that we are beings in constant writing, capable of revising the plot, changing the tone, and reinterpreting the difficult chapters. Life is not a closed script. It is an open plot, full of possibilities for reinterpretation. Every choice we make, every memory we highlight, every hope we nurture, all of this is part of the construction of this living text we call the self. For Plotinus, one of the great figures of Neoplatonism, human existence is marked by a silent longing, the desire to return to our divine origin. The true self is not realized in the external world, in possessions, or in sensory pleasures. It can only be found by turning inward on a journey of transcendence toward the absolute. According to Plotinus, the soul is an emanation of the One, the supreme, simple, and perfect reality from which everything derives. However, when the soul becomes involved with the sensible world, It forgets its origin. Distracted by the multiplicities of matter, it fragments, loses its inner unity, and drifts away from the source that gives it life. The spiritual task, then, is reintegration. It is not about despising the world, but recognizing that it is merely an imperfect reflection of the greater reality. The path back to the One requires the soul to purify itself from external attachments, quiet the distractions of the senses, and dive deep within, in search of the light that still shines within. This journey is not merely intellectual. It is not enough to accumulate knowledge about the divine. It is necessary to transform one's own being. The inner ascent described by Plotinus is a process of detachment, contemplation, and love for the absolute. As the soul rises, it sheds the more superficial layers of existence and reconnects on deeper and deeper levels with the unity that has always been latent within it. Transcending the self in this context does not mean annihilating individuality, but overcoming its illusory limitations. It is about recognizing that our ultimate identity is not in social roles, material possessions, or fleeting emotions, but in communion with something infinitely greater. Plotinus describes this supreme experience as a silent fusion, no longer two, soul and the One, but a single reality where all separation dissolves. True happiness for him is not found outside, but in this return to full being, where all lack and all desires cease. The search for transcendence is, therefore, an invitation to inner depth, simplicity, and profoundness. It is a reminder that the source of our fullness is not outside, but silently pulses within us. No self is born complete. For G.W.F. Hegel, personal identity is the result of a dynamic dialectical process that is only fully realized in recognition by the other. We are not isolated individuals shaping ourselves in a vacuum. Our consciousness of who we are is built through the living relationship with other human beings. Hegel observes that, from the very beginning of life, we seek to assert ourselves as subjects. We want to be recognized as conscious, free, and worthy beings. But this recognition cannot be achieved alone. It requires the gaze and response of the other. It is through the clash between consciousnesses, in a process of tension, negation, and overcoming, that the self develops. This movement is dialectical because it involves contradictions and reconciliations. In seeking recognition, the self encounters the resistance of otherness. The other also wants to be affirmed, also fights for its own freedom. True recognition, then, is not one submitting to the other, but the construction of a relationship of mutual validation, in which each one recognizes in the other a free and conscious subject, just like themselves. This idea is powerful because it breaks with the individualistic view of identity. According to Hegel, being fully human means entering into this mirror game, this interactive process where I see myself reflected while also being differentiated. My freedom is realized not against the other, but together with the other. Thus, the self is not a rigid substance, but a living movement, an internal and external drama of assertions, conflicts, and syntheses. Each phase of our life, childhood, youth, maturity, is marked by new forms of recognition and therefore of self-construction. Identity is an ongoing story where the dialectic never stops. This perspective has deep ethical and social implications. No human being realizes themselves in isolation. For Hegel, a just society is one that allows for mutual recognition between free individuals, where each can assert their uniqueness without suppressing the others. In times when individuality is often confused with isolation or narcissism, Hegel's view is an essential reminder: to be myself is necessarily to be in relation. And for you, in what moments of life did you feel truly recognized and recognized the other in their fullness? In a world that changes every moment, Zygmunt Bauman invites us to reflect on the new condition of being, liquid identity. If in the past, the self could rely on solid structures, religion, tradition, family, community, in postmodernity, everything becomes fluid, unstable, and subject to constant reinvention. Bauman observes that in contemporary societies, stability has become the exception. Relationships, professions, values, and life projects are temporary, changeable, and disposable. This fluidity directly impacts how we build our identity. The self is no longer something we find or inherit. It is something we improvise, adapt, and rebuild as the fast-paced flow of social life unfolds. This fluidity, on the one hand, brings a freedom never before experienced. We can change careers, cities, lifestyles, and beliefs. We are invited, or pressured, to be entrepreneurs of ourselves, constantly shaping our paths as new opportunities and demands arise. On the other hand, this same freedom brings anxiety. Without solid foundations, identity becomes a fragile and uncertain project. The need to be someone becomes a continuous burden because there are no guarantees that the image we build today will serve us tomorrow. The fear of failure and personal obsolescence follows the individual who lives under the imperative to reinvent themselves to avoid disappearing. Bauman describes this condition with great sensitivity. The liquid self is both free and vulnerable, creative and anxious, dynamic and lost. The liquidity of modern life erodes the idea of a coherent narrative of who we are. Instead of continuous paths, we have fragments, disconnected episodes, multiple versions of the self coexisting or replacing each other. In this context, the challenge is not just to find an identity, but to maintain some form of inner cohesion amidst the constant external flow. For Bauman, the search for authenticity becomes even more difficult, and at the same time, more urgent. How can we be true to ourselves when everything around us and within us changes all the time? The invitation is for critical reflection, to recognize fluidity without succumbing to it, to build a flexible identity without losing the sense of continuity that gives depth to existence. Amid the unrest of life, Epictetus points us in a simple and profound direction. The highest goal of existence is to achieve ataraxia, peace of the mind. For him, the true self is not revealed in the turmoil of endless desires or in the race for prestige or power, but in the serene state of one who overcomes irrational fears and learns to live wisely. Epicurus saw the main sources of human anguish in two great fears: the fear of the gods and the fear of death. To free oneself, it was necessary to dissolve these illusions with reason. The gods, he argued, exist but are not concerned with human affairs. Therefore, there is nothing to fear. Death, on the other hand, is not an evil. When it comes, we are no longer here to suffer. Fearing it is fearing what will never be experienced. Overcoming these fears is the first step toward ataraxia, but it is not the only one. Epicurus also warns against disordered desires, those that can never be fully satisfied and that keep us in a perpetual state of frustration. Desiring fame, unlimited wealth, or extravagant pleasures is creating an invisible prison for oneself. True wisdom, according to Epicurus, is distinguishing between natural and necessary desires, natural but unnecessary desires, and completely vain desires. Eating to satisfy hunger, seeking friendship, living modestly, these are desires that lead to peace. In contrast, the unchecked desire for luxury, power, or social recognition only fuels suffering. Finding the true self in this philosophy is returning to the simplicity of what really matters. It is choosing a peaceful life over an extravagant life. It is valuing small, lasting pleasures, a conversation with friends, contemplating nature, practicing justice, over the misleading promises of excess. Ataraxia is not a cold indifference to life, but a lucid acceptance of what is within our control and what is not. It is cultivating the serene joy of someone who is not disturbed by unrealistic expectations, nor shaken by the fickle winds of fate. In a fast-paced world that values excitement and constant novelty, Epicurus's proposal is more relevant than ever. Slow down, think clearly, and seek peace within ourselves. In a world where many seek security in the collective, Søren Kierkegaard reminds us that true existence requires authenticity, and that being authentic is, above all, being faithful to oneself. This is not a selfish pursuit, but a deep responsibility to live with passion and seriousness in one's own uniqueness, without getting lost in the expectations and pressures of the masses. Kierkegaard saw society as fertile ground for escaping oneself. In the comfort of the group, the individual can dilute their existential anxiety, avoid the weight of choices, and live superficially, repeating patterns without reflection. This herd mentality, as he describes it, is a form of numbness, a lukewarm existence where no one has to confront the abyss of freedom. Against this temptation, Kierkegaard proposes the path of authentic existence, recognizing that each person is a unique, non-transferable project, one that must be lived with courage. Being true to oneself is accepting the responsibility of building one's life from within, not from external expectations. It is fully owning the weight of one's choices, knowing that no one else can live our life for us. This fidelity also means living with passion. A passion not in the sense of losing control, but of vital intensity. For Kierkegaard, the authentic life is not made of soulless routines. It is marked by a living relationship with one's own values, dreams, and anxieties. Being authentic means not living on autopilot. It means diving seriously into the challenge of being yourself. The journey toward this authenticity is not easy. It involves facing the fear of loneliness, misunderstanding, and failure. It involves recognizing the vertigo that freedom causes. But only in this journey can the true self emerge, not as something given, but as something earned moment by moment. Kierkegaard teaches us that authenticity is not a mask of being different, but a silent and radical commitment. The commitment not to betray what is most intimate in us, even when it places us in collision with the world. In times when it is so easy to lose oneself in the voice of the majority, this lesson is an urgent invitation. Being true to oneself is the hardest, but also the most necessary path. In a time marked by fascination with the external world, Plotinus invites us to take the opposite direction, to look inward, seeking liberation not in the accumulation of sensory experiences, but in the purification of the soul. For him, rediscovering our original purity requires asceticism and virtue, a continuous movement of turning away from the distractions of the material world toward the divine essence that resides within us. According to Plotinus, the soul is originally pure and radiant, an inseparable part of the One, the absolute principle of all existence. However, when it becomes too involved with the material world, it scatters, forgets its origin, and becomes trapped in the illusions of the senses. Pleasure, possession, the endless pursuit of recognition. All of this, in Plotinus's view, distances the soul from its true nature. Asceticism, understood here as inner discipline, is the process through which the soul frees itself from these constraints. It is not about rejecting the body or demonizing the world, but about placing each thing in its proper place. The sensible life is not an end in itself. It is a step that must be overcome on the way to something higher. The practice of virtue is essential on this path. Virtues like temperance, courage, justice, and wisdom are not just moral qualities. They are tools for spiritual elevation. Every virtuous act purifies the soul, reduces its attachment to the transient, and strengthens its ability to turn toward the eternal. This liberation is, above all, an inner work. It does not depend on external circumstances, but on the constant willingness to cultivate what is true and lasting. The soul that turns to the One recognizes that its happiness does not lie in things that can be taken away, wealth, status, pleasures, but in a living connection with what is unchanging and complete. Plotinus describes this final union with the One as an experience of ecstasy, a moment when the soul transcends all differences, abandons all illusory individuality, and silently merges with the source of being. This ecstasy is not a random reward, but the natural fruit of persistent asceticism and virtue. Rediscovering the soul's original purity, therefore, is not a distant dream. It is a concrete task, made of daily choices, silent renunciations, and a deep love for what is eternal. And you, what practices help you reconnect with what is most true in yourself? For Friedrich Nietzsche, life should not just be lived, it should be created. More than a mechanical process of survival or a succession of duties, existence is a unique opportunity to transform oneself into an aesthetic masterpiece. Instead of simply obeying norms or repeating traditions, Nietzsche challenges us to shape our own lives the way an artist shapes their creation. This idea comes from his radical critique of inherited values. For Nietzsche, traditional moral systems, often based on the denial of life and blind obedience, suffocate the creative power of the human being. Instead, he proposes that the individual take responsibility for creating new values, new ways of existing, based on their own experience. To live as art means, first, to embrace the imperfection of existence. Just as a work of art carries traces of struggle, attempts, and even failures, an authentic life is also built through risk and experimentation. The true creator does not seek security, but expression, and this expression requires the courage to affirm one's uniqueness amid society's pressures to conform. Nietzsche invites us to think of our lives the way an artist would think about their work, with intention, vision, and passion. Every choice, every gesture, every relationship can be another stroke in the great painting of our existence. It's not about seeking perfection in the traditional sense, but about achieving wholeness, a personal harmony that reflects our deepest will to live intensely and truly. This aesthetic conception of life also brings an important consequence. We are called to fully take authorship of who we are. We can no longer blame fate, others, or circumstances. To be the artist of one's own life is to be radically free, and therefore radically responsible. Nietzsche knew this task was not easy. Living as art requires resistance to the temptations of mediocrity, empty routine, and conformity. But it is precisely in this continuous effort to create that life gains depth, beauty, and meaning. The question Nietzsche asks us still echoes today. If you were the artist of your own life, what masterpiece would you be creating right now? Meister Eckhart, a 13th century mystic and theologian, taught that the truest spiritual journey begins with a radical act, letting go of the ego. For him, as long as we are trapped in the images we create of ourselves, our desires, our fears, our ambitions, we will remain disconnected from the deepest being that silently resides within us. The mystical experience, according to Eckhart, is not something reserved for extraordinary moments. It is a constant inner movement of emptying. It's not about adding more ideas, more beliefs, more identities, but about removing the layers that obscure the essence. Like a sculptor who, by removing excess stone, reveals the hidden form, the spiritual seeker must free themselves from everything that separates them from their true source. The ego, in this view, is the central illusion. It's the idea of a self that is separate, isolated, concerned with asserting its own importance in relation to the world. Eckhart saw attachment to the ego as the root of all anxiety, of all inner division. The more we try to build a solid image of ourselves, the further we move away from the living reality that transcends any definition. Transcending the ego is not about annihilating individuality, but about allowing the deep self, that which is beyond names, beyond labels, to emerge. This experience is described by Eckhart as a state of union. No longer the I seeking God, but God living silently through the I. To reach this union, a radical detachment is necessary. Letting go of personal desires, attachments to possessions, and status games, not out of disdain for the world, but because only an empty heart can be filled by the infinite. Eckhart teaches that it is in the nothingness of the ego that the fullness of being is revealed. This transcendence is not a withdrawal from life, but a deeper immersion in it. One who overcomes the ego does not escape the world. They live it more purely, more freely, more compassionately. They act not out of fear, not out of vanity, but out of love. A love that springs directly from the center of being. In times when the ego is exalted and constantly nourished, Meister Eckhart's wisdom is an urgent call. To reconnect with our essence, we must first have the courage to empty ourselves. And you? Have you ever experienced moments when you felt beyond yourself, connected to something greater? Leave your comment. Let's reflect together on the silent path that leads to the deepest being. Erich Fromm, one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, warns us about a silent but devastating condition, self-alienation. In a world shaped by consumerism and social pressure, the individual risks losing themselves in artificial roles and an obsession with material goods, forgetting who they truly are. Fromm observes that modern society, although it celebrates freedom and individuality, often creates individuals who are deeply disconnected from themselves. We are led to believe that our value lies in what we own, the status we project, the masks we manage to wear. Instead of developing an authentic self, we often reduce ourselves to functions: the efficient professional, the ideal consumer, the perfect image on social media. This alienation doesn't happen violently, it settles in subtly. We begin to measure our life in terms of performance, accumulation, and appearance. Gradually, we forget our truest desires, our deepest dreams, and we start living according to external expectations, shaped by forces we don't always understand. For Fromm, this loss of connection with the self creates an inner emptiness, a feeling of disorientation, apathy, chronic dissatisfaction, which no new acquisition, no new title or recognition can fill. We are, in his words, automatons who call their alienation happiness. Breaking free from this alienation requires a courageous return to inner awareness. It's not enough to criticize the system or lament the superficiality of the modern world. We must undertake a true search for ourselves. This search involves self-knowledge, authenticity, and, most importantly, a conscious refusal to reduce life to utilitarian roles. Fromm suggests that reconnecting with the true self happens through the practice of responsible freedom. The act of living creatively, expressing oneself honestly, building authentic relationships based on being, not having. Personal fulfillment for him is not found in the quantity of things accumulated, but in the quality of being that we manage to develop. Finding the self, then, is an act of resistance. It is refusing the silent alienation that turns life into a commodity. It is affirming the dignity of human existence amidst the pressures that try to reduce it. For Martin Buber, a human being only becomes fully themselves in a living and authentic relationship with the other. In his fundamental work, I and Thou, he describes two distinct ways of relating to the world. One that is instrumental and utilitarian, the I-it, and another that is deep and transformative, the I-thou. In the I-it mode, we treat everything and everyone as objects, things to be used, categorized, and manipulated. Relationships at this level are functional and superficial. The other is seen merely as a means to our ends, and the self remains closed, distant, fragmented. In the I-thou mode, something radically different happens. The other is no longer an object, but a being with whom we have a genuine encounter. In this encounter, we do not project expectations or use the other as an instrument. We simply stand before them with presence, openness, and recognition. And it is precisely in this space, between the I and the thou, that the true self is revealed. Buber teaches that authentic love is the highest expression of this I-thou relationship. Not possessive love, which seeks to dominate, nor conditional love, which depends on merit or utility, but a love that recognizes in the other an existence as full as one's own, and in that recognition also discovers itself in depth. The realization of the self, therefore, does not happen in isolation or in the solitary search for identity. It happens in the encounter, in the living dialogue, in the relational space where two beings recognize and affirm each other. For Beauvoir, only in this act of authentic reciprocity does the self reach its fullness. This teaching is especially challenging in a world where so many relationships are mediated by interests, social masks, and calculated exchanges. Recovering the experience of I-thou requires courage for vulnerability, true listening, and unreserved surrender. Moreover, Beauvoir points out that the experience of I-thou is not limited to human relationships. We can experience the thou in encounters, with nature, with art, and with the mystery that permeates existence. In each true I-thou relationship, we touch something greater, something that transcends and gives meaning to our own existence. Love, in this sense, is not just a feeling. It is a way of being in the world, a way of living that connects us, transforms us, and reveals us. Maurice Merleau-Ponty broke with the old separation between body and mind by stating that the body is not just another object in the world, it is the very expression of being. We do not inhabit a body as we would an external house. We are our body. Identity, therefore, is lived directly in our bodily experience, not separate from it. Since childhood, we experience the world through our bodies. We touch, see, move, suffer, and celebrate. Even before we know who we are conceptually, we already exist bodily. The body is our first language, our first way of inhabiting the world. It is not a prison of the soul, as some ancient philosophers thought, but the living bridge between the self and the world. Merleau-Ponty shows that consciousness and the body are intertwined. To think, feel, act. Everything happens from our bodily existence. Even our most subtle actions, such as memory, desire, or imagination, carry traces of the body. We are beings who live in space, time, and movement, and it is through this embodied presence that we build our identity. Ignoring this dimension is to alienate oneself from who we truly are. In a culture that often values only physical appearance or tries to control the body through external standards, recovering this awareness of the body is an act of deep reconnection. The body is not something to be controlled or improved, only it is something to be listened to, respected, and understood as an essential part of our existence. Merleau-Ponty also teaches us that the body is silent language. It speaks through gestures, expressions, and posture. It communicates who we are, often more truly than words can. Thus, identity manifests in every small movement, every breath, every presence. To fully live in the body is to live authentically. It is to accept that our emotions, our thoughts, and our relationships are embodied. We are not a mind distant from the physical world. We are a sensitive being, shaped by the world and capable of making sense of it through our embodied experience. Thinking of the body as the expression of being also reminds us that our freedom, creativity, and presence are realized in the here and now, in this body that feels, acts, and transforms. For Emmanuel Levinas, the true discovery of the self does not happen in isolation or in solitary introspection. The self is revealed in the living and ethical relationship with the other. We are called to our deepest uniqueness the moment we recognize the responsibility that the face of the other imposes on us. Levinas breaks with the philosophical tradition that sought to define the self starting from itself. For him, human existence is, from the very beginning, marked by the encounter with what is absolutely different, the other. This encounter is not a simple interaction between two individuals. It is a shock, a call that takes us out of our comfort and demands that we respond. The face of the other, as Levinas describes it, is not just a physical appearance. It is the manifestation of vulnerability, need, and transcendence that resides in every human being. In the face of the other, we cannot remain neutral. We are immediately placed in a position of responsibility. And it is in this ethical call that our existence acquires uniqueness. To be unique, for Levinas, is to be irreplaceable in our responsibility toward the other. We are not just one among many. We are the one who, in the face of the other, is called to act, to care, to respect. Ethics here precedes any knowledge or definition. Before being consciousness, reason, or will, we are responsibility. This conception profoundly challenges modern individualism. The self is not defined by its ability to assert itself against the world, but by its openness to otherness. True freedom is not doing whatever we want, but recognizing that my existence is irrevocably tied to caring for the other. In Levinas' view, the self only truly discovers itself when it stops placing itself at the center of everything and recognizes that there is something, or rather, someone, who comes before it, the other. The uniqueness of each existence, therefore, is not a closed property, but a living response, a surrender that makes the self unique precisely because it is uniquely called to love, protect, and listen. This view profoundly transforms the way we understand our relationship with the world and with other people. We are not islands. We are faces turned toward each other, bound by a silent and infinite responsibility. Theodor Adorno, one of the most incisive thinkers of the 20th century, offers us a troubling reflection on identity. The true self cannot be reduced to fixed categories or pre-established labels. In his philosophy of non-identity, he warns against the danger of trying to capture the complexity of the human being in rigid and oversimplified definitions. We live in a society that constantly invites, or rather pressures, us to fit into clear identities, professions, genders, nationalities, social roles. But for Adorno, every attempt to totalize the self, to close it in a static definition, is a form of conceptual violence. Life is always richer, more contradictory, and more subtle than any category we try to impose on it. The idea of non-identity arises from the refusal to accept the world as something fully understandable or manageable. Similarly, the authentic self resists being fully captured in words, norms, or images. There is always an excess, a difference, an opening that escapes. Adorno saw this resistance as an ethical force. It is not just an intellectual issue, but an attitude toward life. Recognizing the complexity of reality, refusing to reduce oneself or others to caricatures. True fidelity to the self requires recognizing that we are multiple, dynamic, and in constant transformation. This critique of totalization also warns us of social dangers. When society tries to standardize individuals, erasing their nuances in the name of efficiency, consumption, or normalization, something essential in humanity is lost. Defending non-identity is, therefore, an act of resistance against the forces that attempt to tame the richness of human experience. In daily life, this philosophy challenges us to live with openness, to accept our own contradictions, to embrace the ambiguities of others, to refuse easy answers about who we are. We don't need to fixate on a single or definitive narrative. We are stories in progress, beings who reinvent themselves, fragments that dialogue, multiplicities that coexist. The true self, according to Adorno, is the one that remains faithful to its incompleteness, to its ability to change, to surprise, to escape the frames. And have you ever felt the pressure to fit into a label that doesn't fully define you? For Hannah Arendt, freedom is not just the ability to choose between options or act in private. True freedom is realized when we appear in the public space through action, when we authentically reveal ourselves to others and to the world. For Arendt, the essence of the human being is not something hidden to be discovered only through introspection. On the contrary, we become who we are by acting, speaking, and inserting ourselves into the fabric of human relationships. Identity is not something we carry as a secret property. It is formed and manifested in the actions we choose to perform in front of others. Arendt emphasizes that action is always unpredictable and unique. When we act, we are not simply following a predetermined script. We introduce something new into the world. And it is in this novelty that freedom appears. Not as repetition, but as living creation, as the ability to begin something that didn't exist before. The public space is, therefore, more than a physical location. It is the symbolic space where we are seen, heard, and recognized. It is there that our words and gestures gain meaning, where our existence takes on weight and significance. To be authentic for Arendt is to have the courage to expose oneself, to commit to the unpredictability of action, and to accept that our identity is only complete in the encounter and impact we make on the world. This conception of freedom breaks with the idea that being free means living isolated or self-sufficient. Freedom is always a phenomenon between people. I am only free when I can act and be recognized in a community of equals. Freedom, therefore, requires a political space, an environment where dialogue, debate, and plurality are possible. From Arendt's perspective, the alienation of modern life comes, in large part, from the loss of these authentic public spaces. When people retreat into the private sphere or dissolve into undifferentiated masses, they also lose the opportunity to fully realize their freedom and essence. Being authentic, then, is not just being true to oneself internally, but daring to appear in the world, accepting responsibility for our actions, and leaving a unique mark on the course of collective existence. And you, how have you put your freedom into action in the world around you? For Jacques Derrida, the self is not a solid and stable entity. The idea of a fixed and definite subject is, in itself, a construction, something that needs to be continuously deconstructed. Derrida proposes that the self is more like a text than an essence, a text always in motion, open to multiple interpretations, rewritten with every experience. In Western philosophical tradition, the subject has often been conceived as a full presence of itself, a secure starting point for knowledge and action. Derrida questions this security. He shows that all identity is constructed through differences, relationships, and contexts, never being completely closed within itself. Just like a text never carries a single, definitive meaning, the self is constantly unfolding into new meanings, new possibilities. Each relationship, each choice, each memory adds new layers of interpretation. The self, then, is a living intertwining of narratives, some conscious, others unconscious, that never fully close. Deconstructing the subject is not about destroying it, but revealing its radical openness. It's about recognizing that our identity is not an unchanging rock, but a network of meanings that transforms over time. And this openness, far from being a weakness, is precisely what makes human life so rich and dynamic. Derrida also warns us of the dangers of seeking a purely static identity. Every time we try to fix who we are rigidly, whether through labels, absolutized traditions, or single narratives, we risk denying the complexity of our own existence. Deconstruction, therefore, is an act of freedom. It allows us to recognize our internal multiplicity and the plurality of the world. Living from the perspective of deconstruction is to accept that we are always in process, that we are always more than any definition that others try to impose on us, or that we try to impose on ourselves. It's living attentively to the nuances, the gaps, the possibilities that each experience brings in rethinking who we are. The self, like a text, never closes. It remains open, continuously offering itself to interpretation, dialogue, and transformation. And, for you, which chapters of your story are still being written? Rainer Maria Rilke saw solitude not as a punishment or a failure, but as an essential condition for the formation of the true self. In his letters and poems, he insists, finding oneself requires facing solitude creatively, embracing it as part of inner growth. In a world that values constant sociability and endless noise, Rilke's proposal feels almost subversive. For him, solitude is the space where the soul can finally hear itself. It's not a bitter isolation, but a fertile retreat where we can break free from others' expectations and touch the deeper layers of our being. According to Rilke, many fear solitude because in it we are forced to confront ourselves, without masks, without distractions. In this silence, doubts, fears, and forgotten hopes emerge, and with them, the real possibility of transformation. Only those who can endure this intimate encounter with their own existence can build a true identity, not shaped solely by external pressures. Creative solitude is not a withdrawal from the world, but a quiet preparation to inhabit it more fully. Just as a seed needs time buried in darkness before it blooms, humans also need moments of retreat to mature their inner strengths. It is in solitude that imagination expands, thought deepens, and sensitivity sharpens its gaze on life. Rilke advises, love your solitude. Instead of fighting it with empty distractions, we should embrace it as a natural part of the journey. Spiritual maturity is born from this acceptance, not as an escape from the world, but as preparation for a more authentic encounter with it and with others. This view is especially powerful today, in times of hyperconnection and emotional shallowness. Solitude, when well lived, offers resistance to emptiness. It invites us to create roots in ourselves, to discover sources of meaning that do not depend on the gaze or validation of others. Finding oneself, for Rilke, is a quiet, patient, loving act, an inner cultivation that transforms the solitude of the desert into a garden. And you? How have you lived your moments of solitude, as emptiness or as fertile ground for your own transformation? For William James, a pioneer in psychology and pragmatist philosophy, the self is not a simple or uniform entity. On the contrary, it is marked by a fundamental paradox. We are, at the same time, both a unity and a multiplicity of experiences. The self is a living synthesis of many selves that coexist, interact, and sometimes even conflict within us. James observes that our daily experience is made up of a continuous succession of states of consciousness. Each emotion, each thought, each perception creates a new momentary self. There is the self that feels fear, the self that desires, the self that remembers, and the self that dreams of the future. These selves seem fragmented, but surprisingly, they maintain a thread of continuity between them. This continuity is not rigid, but flexible. It's like a river that, while always flowing, is still recognized as the same river. So too is our identity, changeable in its content, but capable of maintaining a sense of unity over time. For James, this dynamic unity is what makes the experience of being someone possible. The paradox of the self reveals that we are not prisoners of a fixed essence, nor are we doomed to chaotic dispersion. We are a living construction, capable of integrating different dimensions, reason and emotion, memory and expectation, body and mind, into a whole that is never fully finished. This view offers a special freedom. If we are a multiplicity, we can change, grow, and reinvent ourselves. We are not limited to a single narrative about who we are. But at the same time, this multiplicity requires a center of gravity, a consciousness that, even without being absolute, allows us to recognize the connections between our various states of being. James also points out that this complexity of the self requires attention and care. If we ignore parts of ourselves, our repressed desires, our anxieties, our forgotten dreams, we risk losing our inner coherence. Living well, in this sense, means being able to embrace multiplicity without losing the thread of our own story. The right self, then, is not a fixed point in time. It is a process, an adventure of integration, where every new experience is an opportunity to expand, reorganize, and deepen who we are. And you, Have you noticed how many versions of yourself coexist within you? For Jacques Lacan, one of the leading thinkers in contemporary psychoanalysis, the essence of the human being is not in a complete and secure identity, but in a fundamental lack. From the beginning, we are beings of desire, and it is precisely this lack that structures what we call the self. Lacan breaks with the traditional idea that the self is a cohesive and solid entity. For him, our identity is born from emptiness, a space of absence that drives us to seek, want, and build meaning. We don't just desire concrete objects. We desire to be. We desire recognition. We desire to fill a void that can never be fully filled. Since childhood, Lacan explains, the formation of the self passes through what he calls the mirror stage. When the child sees their reflection, they recognize a unified image of themselves and identify with it. But this image is in fact an illusion of wholeness. Inside, the being remains fragmented, divided between what is lived and what is represented. This split is never fully overcome. We spend our lives searching for something we believe will complete us: love, success, knowledge. But deep down, we know it will never truly satisfy us completely. Desire in this way is endless, constantly renewing itself, driving our existence forward. Far from being a problem to be fixed, this lack is, for Lacan, what makes us human. Desire pulls us out of stagnation, pushing us toward creation, relationships with others, the building of stories and projects. Therefore, identity is not something that is achieved once and for all, but a field in constant motion, shaped by the multiple forms of desire. The self, in this sense, is a narrative woven around lack. We try to make sense of what we lack. We try to name and symbolize our desires, even though we know, deep down, that no object, no achievement will be the end of the journey. We are beings in search, forever cast into the realm of desire. Lacan teaches us that recognizing this structure is not a cause for despair, but for growth. Accepting that we are lack and desire is accepting the living dynamic of existence. It's understanding that the fullness we so deeply seek is, paradoxically, in the search itself. Jiddu Krishnamurti, one of the great spiritual teachers of the 20th century, proposed a radical view of the search for the true self. It is not in the endless noise of the mind that we find ourselves, but in inner silence. For him, the restless mind, full of thoughts, judgments, and desires, creates a veil that separates us from what we truly are at our core. Krishnamurti does not invite us to a forced or imposed silence, but to a stillness that arises from deep understanding. When the mind stops moving compulsively, when it is not busy comparing, fearing, desiring, or resisting, a new dimension of being reveals itself. In this silent space, the self constructed by social pressures, memory, and expectations loses its power, and something more authentic can emerge. To reach this stillness, Krishnamurti does not suggest rigid techniques or specific methods. His approach is one of attentive and unconditioned observation, observing the workings of the mind, its patterns of escape, anxiety, and constant seeking, without judgment, without trying to control. Only then, through vigilant and open awareness, can silence arise naturally. In true silence, there is no effort. There is no self trying to be silent. There is only presence, and it is in this presence, free from interference, that the true self, not the one shaped by words or images, can be touched. It is not about reaching an extraordinary state, but rediscovering what has always been there, covered by the agitation of thought. Krishnamurti saw thinking as useful in many practical aspects, but insufficient to grasp the deep reality of being. Thinking about the self is not the same as being the self. The analytical mind, no matter how brilliant, does not replace the direct experience of being. Thus, inner silence is a gateway to a more integrated, more lucid, and freer way of living. It is in this state that the division between observer and observed, between the self and the world, is broken. allowing for an existence marked by authenticity and peace. So, the search for the true self is not about looking for something outside of us, nor adding new layers of beliefs or identities. It is, paradoxically, a movement of subtraction, letting go of illusions and allowing the self to reveal itself in the open space of silent awareness. In his subtle and profound teachings, Lao Tzu, the master of the Tao Te Ching, reveals an essential principle: the true self manifests in detachment. Instead of clinging to rigid identities or seeking to assert the ego at any cost, the authentic self flows in harmony with the Tao, the invisible and eternal path that sustains all of existence. For Lao Tzu, human error begins when we try to cling to fixed images of who we are. Titles, positions, possessions, even idealized virtues. When we identify too much with these forms, we move away from the natural spontaneity of being. The Tao, by its nature, is fluid, unpredictable, adaptable. Those who wish to live authentically must learn to detach from these rigid constructions and trust in the flow of life. Detachment does not mean indifference or disinterest. On the contrary, it is a radical openness to the movement of existence. It is knowing that we are part of a greater process than our individual will. Just as water shapes itself to the container without losing its essence, the authentic self adapts to circumstances without betraying its inner truth. Lao Tzu teaches that those who cling lose. Those who surrender to the flow, paradoxically, remain. Rigidity, whether in thoughts, emotions, or social identities, is like a dry branch that breaks at the slightest wind. The detached being is like bamboo, flexible, resilient, deeply rooted, but always in harmony with the invisible forces surrounding it. Living detachment is trusting in the wisdom of the Tao within oneself. It is letting go of the compulsive need to control everything, to define everything, to be someone in the eyes of the world. Instead, it is acting with simplicity, modesty, and naturalness, allowing the path to reveal itself step by step. This philosophy is an invitation to lightness. In a world that values accumulation of things, status, certainties, Lao Tzu reminds us that fullness is found in fertile emptiness, in silent surrender, in the wisdom of not clinging even to the self. Detachment, then, does not erase the self. It reveals it in its purest and liveliest form, as an inseparable part of the flow of existence. And you, in what moments have you felt that being flexible and detached allowed something more true to emerge in your life? In his profound work, The Denial of Death, Ernest Becker presents a disturbing yet liberating idea. Finding the true self requires confronting, not denying, the reality of death. According to him, the fear of death is the hidden force that shapes much of our lives, our ambitions, our plans, and even our belief systems. Becker argues that, instead of facing our finite condition with clarity, we create vital lies, illusions that make us believe in our symbolic immortality. We seek glory, fame, and perpetuation through works or legacies, trying to avoid the inevitable end. But in this process, we often move further away from who we truly are, living under the influence of unacknowledged fear. Overcoming the fear of death, for Becker, doesn't mean denying it or minimizing it, but fully integrating it into our consciousness. It's about accepting that we are mortal, and precisely because of that, we are capable of living with intensity, authenticity, and a true sense of the preciousness of the time we have. This acceptance transforms life. Instead of wasting energy, trying to be invulnerable or eternal, we begin to value the present, true relationships, and the choices that really matter. Death stops being an invisible enemy chasing us and becomes a silent advisor, teaching us to live with more courage and depth. Becker also points out that facing death reveals the fragility of the ego. All the constructs we create to protect ourselves, status, social masks, external achievements, are fragile in the face of finitude. Confronting death is therefore an invitation to discover a deeper self, that doesn't rely on illusory guarantees, but on the strength of being conscious and free. Integrating death is integrating our own vulnerability, our own humanity, not as a burden, but as an impulse for a more awake, sincere, and creative life. Those who accept death as a natural part of existence become capable of acting not out of fear, but out of love, joy, and fidelity to their own truth. Thus, for Ernest Becker, a fulfilling life is one in which, recognizing the end, we choose to live with purpose. And you, how do you face the awareness of finitude in your daily life? Leave a comment. Let's reflect together on how the confrontation with death can paradoxically teach us to live more authentically. For Martin Heidegger, authenticity becomes possible only when a person recognizes and accepts their own finitude. Instead of avoiding the reality of death, as society often teaches us to do, the true existential challenge is to face mortality, directly, without illusions, without denial. In Being and Time, Heidegger describes human beings as beings toward death. This does not mean living in constant anxiety or pessimism, but recognizing that death is the most personal, inevitable, and unique possibility for each of us. No one can die for us. Death is non-transferable. And because of this, it confronts us with the uniqueness of our existence. Most people, according to Heidegger, prefer to live in inauthenticity, a life diluted in the everyday, where we hide behind routines, conventions, and distractions to avoid facing the anxiety of our finitude. But this escape distances us from ourselves, turning us into anonymous beings, lost in what is done, is said, is thought. The authentic life begins when we stop denying the fact that we are mortal. When we accept death as an integral part of life, every moment gains a new and deep value. Awareness of finitude does not paralyze us, it awakens us. It becomes a call to live more consciously, more fully, more truthfully. Heidegger shows that accepting mortality is, paradoxically, what liberates us. When we stop clinging to illusions of safety and permanence, we open space for more genuine choices. We are forced to ask, what really matters? How do I want to exist in this limited time I've been given? Living in the shadow of death is living in the light of freedom. Every action, every word, every decision carries an existential weight that cannot be delegated to anyone else. Authenticity is revealed in the courage to inhabit this freedom with responsibility, accepting the fragility of life without surrendering to despair. Heidegger teaches us that finitude is not a mistake to be corrected, but the condition that gives meaning to existence. Only those who recognize death as an inevitable part of being can truly live with depth. And you? How has the awareness of your own finitude transformed the way you live? At the heart of the teachings of Buddha Siddhartha Gautama is a simple yet profound truth. Desire is the root of suffering. To find the true self, it is necessary to transcend not just specific desires, but the very attachment to wanting. It is in the abandonment of desire that the soul finds its freedom and its purest essence. Buddha taught that human existence, as we normally experience it, is marked by dukkha, a sense of dissatisfaction, anguish, and frustration. Even when we attain what we desire, pleasure is brief, and soon a new longing arises. The mind, in its usual state, is never at rest. It desires to possess, avoid, conquer, and protect. This endless cycle of desire and dissatisfaction keeps humans trapped in suffering, like a thirsty traveler chasing mirages in the desert. The problem is not just desire itself, but attachment to it, the illusion that we constantly need something outside ourselves to feel complete. Liberation, according to Buddha, does not come from the forced suppression of desires, but from a deep understanding of their illusory nature. When we clearly see that desire is a movement that pulls us away from ourselves, we begin to loosen our attachment, and in this letting go, we discover something surprising: the true self, silent, full, and independent. By transcending desire, we do not become apathetic or indifferent. On the contrary, we become more alive, more aware of what is real, more open to compassion and wisdom. The absence of uncontrolled desires makes room for deep peace, one that does not depend on external circumstances. Buddha does not propose a retreat from the world, but a new way of being in the world, present, free, conscious. When we are not dominated by the urge to possess or avoid, we can truly see, hear, feel, live. This realization is what he called nirvana, the extinction of the fire of desire that consumes the mind, and the blossoming of a serene and luminous awareness. Finding true identity, then, is not about adding something new to ourselves. It is about removing the veils, desires, fears, attachments that obscure the essence already present, waiting to be recognized. And have you ever experienced moments when, free from desire, you felt a peace greater than anything achievement could bring? Gilbert Ryle, one of the major figures in 20th century analytic philosophy, challenged a deeply ingrained idea in Western culture, the notion that the self is a hidden substance, separate from the body, inhabiting it like a ghost in the machine. For Ryle, this is a fundamental mistake. The self is not a mysterious thing hidden inside us. It is action, a collection of behaviors, habits, and practices. This critique, known as the rejection of the myth of the mind, proposes a radical shift in the way we think about identity. Ryle argues that looking for the self as if it were an internal object is a category mistake. Just as it doesn't make sense to ask where the speed resides in a car, speed is the movement of the car, not something inside it. It also doesn't make sense to look for a substantial self behind actions. The self, for Ryle, manifests directly in action. It is not something we possess beyond what we do. It is what we do. Our ways of speaking, our decisions, our daily choices, the way we face challenges, all of these are expressions of who we are. This perspective breaks down the false separation between mind and body, thought and action. To be someone, in this sense, is not to have a fixed identity locked away inside, but to be a living pattern of behaviors in the world. We are the habits we cultivate, the relationships we weave, the projects we carry out. This also frees us from many philosophical anxieties. We don't have to be trapped in endless introspection seeking a hidden essence. We can look at our concrete actions, our real commitments, and find there the living fabric of who we are. But Ryle's proposal also brings a deep responsibility. If the self is action, then we are constantly constructing ourselves. Every choice, every gesture, contributes to shaping the identity we live. We are not prisoners of a predetermined being. We are free agents, able to reshape who we are by acting in new ways. The self, far from being an unchanging substance, is an ongoing process, a story being told in real time through the attitudes we take, the words we choose, the paths we walk. And you, what everyday actions do you feel best express who you are? For Cornelius Castoriadis, human beings are not fixed entities or the automatic result of social or biological determinism. He offers us a vibrant and dynamic view. The self is a continuous creation, an open work built from the power of radical imagination. Castoriadis breaks with the traditional idea that the self is simply given, like a ready-made essence just waiting to be discovered. Instead, he argues that personal identity is formed through a permanent act of invention. We are beings who do not just respond to the world, but who create new meanings, new ways of being, new possibilities for existence. Radical imagination is what sets us apart. It is not just the ability to represent what already exists, but the power to create what has yet to be. It is the source of all cultural, social, and, above all, existential innovation. It is thanks to this imagination that we are able to reconfigure ourselves, break free from inherited patterns, and forge paths that once seemed impossible. This creation of the self is not something that happens just once, but an uninterrupted process. We are always, consciously or unconsciously, shaping who we are. With every decision, every interpretation, every new project, we take a step in the construction or reconstruction of our identity. Castoriadis also warns that if we stop exercising this creative imagination, we fall into automatic repetition and alienation. When we simply reproduce norms and values without reflecting, we stop being the authors of our own existence. We become passive parts of a social machine instead of living and creative subjects. Being authentic, in Castoriadis's view, is to take on this creative responsibility. It is to understand that no one but ourselves can shape our being. There is no ready-made model, no guaranteed script. There is only the open space of freedom and creation. This philosophy is deeply liberating, but it also requires courage. To create oneself is to take risks, to live with uncertainty, to accept that identity is always provisional, always in transit. The true self is not a destination to be reached, but an adventure to be lived. And you, in which areas of your life, do you feel that you are exercising this radical imagination to recreate who you are? We live in a time where the excess of positivity has become an imperative. Productivity, constant self-affirmation, continuous exposure. These are the currencies of the contemporary world. Amid this saturated environment, Byung-Chul Han proposes a different and urgent path, the ethos of singularity, the recovery of silence and contemplation as ways to reconnect with the true self. For Han, the excess of stimuli and hyperexposure pulls us away from ourselves. We are pressured to be constantly visible, always active, always optimistic. The consequence of this is a worn-out identity, shaped more by the expectations of the environment than by authentic inner listening. Singularity, what makes each of us truly unique, ends up suffocated under layers of performance and consumption. Recovering the ethos of singularity, then, requires a movement of silent resistance. It requires the courage to withdraw, to silence the noise around us, and allow the being to flourish without external pressures. Instead of constantly exposing ourselves to judgment, we must create spaces where thought can mature without hurry, where inner depth can grow. Silence for Han is not absence or emptiness. It is a fertile space where the self can listen to and understand itself. In silent contemplation, the mind stops being merely reactive and becomes creative, reflective, capable of giving new meaning to existence. It is in this retreat that the true self, not the self shaped by social demands, but the essential self, can emerge. This ethos of singularity is also an invitation to slowness. In times when everything is urgent, stopping becomes revolutionary. Contemplation is a subversive act that recovers the depth lost in the superficial rhythm of incessant productivity. Han reminds us that the excess of positivity, by denying suffering, doubt, and pause, impoverishes the human experience. Singularity, on the other hand, includes shadows, silences, and imperfections. Accepting one's vulnerability and complexity is a true gesture of freedom. Finding the true self, therefore, is not about shouting louder in the chorus of positivity. It is about having the courage to listen to what can only be heard in silence, and from there, building an existence that is truly ours. And you, have you reserved spaces for silence and contemplation to reconnect with your own singularity? Nagarjuna, one of the greatest philosophers of Mahayana Buddhism, offers a challenging and liberating view of existence. The true self can only be perceived when we overcome the illusion of a fixed and permanent identity. For him, the ultimate reality is emptiness, shunyata, and understanding this requires a deep practice of radical detachment. In his philosophy, Nagarjuna reveals that everything we perceive, including what we call the self, is interdependent, fluid, and devoid of inherent essence. No entity, no phenomenon, no being has an independent and unchanging existence. Everything arises, transforms, and disappears in an endless dance of relationships and conditions. The fundamental mistake, according to Nagarjuna, is believing in the fixed existence of the self. We create a rigid idea of identity, cling to it, and suffer when life, with its natural impermanence, challenges these illusions. We want things to last forever, our status, our love, our certainties, but the world and ourselves are in constant becoming. The practice of radical detachment, then, is not just a renunciation of material possessions or external relationships. It is a deeper detachment, detaching from the very idea of a substantial, separate, and eternal self. It is recognizing that identity is a flow, a continuous construction, not an essence carved in stone. This understanding does not lead to nihilism, as many might fear, but to liberation. When we stop clinging to illusory constructs, we make space to live with lightness, flexibility, and compassion. We stop fighting against impermanence and begin to flow with it, embracing each moment as unique and irreplaceable. Radical detachment invites us to live without fear of change, without the anxiety of preserving what by nature is destined to transform. In this deep acceptance, we discover a freedom that does not depend on keeping things the way they are, but that flourishes precisely in the ability to embrace impermanence as part of the very being. For Nagarjuna, finding the true self is finding emptiness, not as an abyss of absence, but as the open space where life can manifest in its fullness. And you, how do you deal with the constant transformation that life imposes? For Jean-Paul Sartre, being authentic is an act of rebellion, a conscious resistance against bad faith, that subtle and powerful tendency that leads us to deny our own freedom. At the heart of his existentialist philosophy, Sartre argues that the individual only finds themselves by rejecting all excuses and fully embracing the responsibility of being free. Bad faith is a form of self-deception. It is when we try to convince ourselves that we are only what circumstances, social roles, or biology say we are. It is the attitude of saying, I have no choice. I am this way because I was made this way. I can't change. For Sartre, this attitude is a quiet betrayal of our most fundamental freedom. The human being, Sartre teaches, is freedom incarnate. We do not have a fixed nature that determines us. We exist first, and then, through the choices we make, we define ourselves. Every action, every decision, every refusal or acceptance shapes who we are. There is no escape. Even omission is a choice, and we are responsible for it. Being authentic, in this context, is refusing the temptation to hide behind excuses. It is facing the weight of freedom with courage, recognizing that we are the authors, not just the products, of our existence. Authenticity requires that we accept this condition without escape, without masks, without the comfortable protection of bad faith. This rebellion against bad faith is not made of grand words, but of quiet daily acts, choosing consciously, acting in line with what we recognize as true, taking the risks and consequences of our own decisions. There are no guarantees, no ready-made formulas, just the radical responsibility to create ourselves every moment. Sartre does not deny that this freedom can be distressing. In the absence of absolute external foundations, we may feel lost, but it is in this anxiety that the greatness of human existence also lies, the unique ability to invent meaning, to carve new paths, to affirm life despite its lack of guarantees. Rebellion, for Sartre, is not blind revolt against the world, but silent loyalty to oneself. It is the courage to be free in a universe where this freedom is both a gift and an infinite responsibility. And you, in what moments have you felt that rejecting excuses and taking responsibility for your choices brought you closer to your true self? Martin Heidegger takes us on a bold and profound reflection. It is in the encounter with nothingness that the human being faces their authentic existence. In his thinking, especially in Being and Time, he describes the experience of anxiety as a key to understanding being in a more truthful way. In daily life, we are immersed in activities, distractions, and responsibilities. We take on social roles, follow routines, and adopt inherited beliefs. All of this creates a sense of familiarity and security, as if we are always at home in the world. However, according to Heidegger, this sense is a kind of veil that hides the depth of our existence. Anxiety breaks through this veil. Unlike fear, which has a specific object, we fear something. Anxiety is a diffuse feeling without a defined object. In true anxiety, everything that was familiar loses its meaning. The world around us becomes empty of significance, and we find ourselves faced with nothingness. This nothingness is not a physical destruction, but an existential revelation. It reveals that there are no absolute guarantees, that our existence is not supported by eternal foundations. Feeling nothingness is realizing that we are beings thrown into the world without a predetermined essence, responsible for building our own identity in the face of the abyss of freedom. Paradoxically, it is in this moment of emptiness that the authentic self can emerge. When all masks and certainties fall, we are left only with ourselves, free, vulnerable, confronted with the need to choose ourselves. Anxiety, although uncomfortable, has the power to pull the human being out of inauthenticity and bring them back to their original freedom. Heidegger teaches that authenticity is born from the courage to remain in the face of nothingness without fleeing, without seeking refuge in distractions, without hiding behind comforting explanations. Living authentically means living up to this radical freedom, taking responsibility for one's own existence in all its finitude and openness. Thus, nothingness is not the end, but the space where the creation of the self becomes possible. It is the fertile void where authentic life can be sown. And you, have you ever lived moments when, in the face of anxiety, you felt your existence revealed in a more raw and truthful way? Henry David Thoreau believed that true life is not found in great accumulations or spectacular achievements, but in the ability to reconnect with essential simplicity. In his work, Walden, he narrates his experience of voluntary isolation in nature, where he sought to reduce his existence to the bare minimum in order to hear the authentic voice of his own being. For Thoreau, the artificial complexity of modern society distances us from ourselves. We are so busy collecting goods, status, and unnecessary commitments that we forget to live fully and consciously. The constant search for more wealth, more distractions, more recognition, takes us away from what is truly essential for the human soul. Simplifying life is not an act of bitter renunciation, but a joyful liberation. It is a deliberate choice to eliminate what is unnecessary so we can finally connect with what matters. Thoreau did not see simplicity as poverty, but as a deeper wealth, the wealth of being present, savoring the moment, and cultivating our own thoughts. By cutting out excess, we begin to realize that much of what we thought was indispensable was in fact dead weight. In simplicity, we rediscover the pleasure of contemplation, the value of silence, and the beauty of everyday life. More than that, we start to hear the inner voice that so often gets lost in the noise of modern life. For Thoreau, living deliberately, choosing every aspect of existence with awareness, is an act of resistance and authenticity. It is not about fleeing from society or responsibility, but about refusing blind conformity and affirming a life that is more intimate, more faithful to one's own values. Simplicity is, therefore, a path to self-knowledge. By freeing ourselves from external pressures, we can ask more honestly, who are we when we are not trying to impress, accumulate, or compete? Reconnecting with simplicity is reconnecting with the self that does not need masks or excesses to exist with dignity and joy. Thoreau reminds us that we don't need to go far to live fully. We just need to be attentive, choose wisely, and walk lightly. Friedrich Nietzsche teaches us that authenticity does not come from denying inner conflicts, but from the ability to accept and integrate the tension between reason and instinct. In his view, Human beings are shaped by two fundamental forces: the Apollonian principle, which represents order, clarity, and measure, and the Dionysian principle, which embodies impulse, intoxication, and creative chaos. Nietzsche sees Apollo as the symbol of reason, form, and the light that organizes the world into understandable structures. On the other hand, Dionysus represents vital drive, the dark force that breaks boundaries, embraces excess, transformation, and the dissolution of the self in the deep rhythms of existence. According to Nietzsche, authentic life does not lie in choosing one of these sides, but in maintaining the living tension between them. Reason without instinct becomes sterile, mechanical, and incapable of creation. Instinct without form gets lost in blind destruction. The human challenge, then, is to find an unstable harmony between the domain of reason and the power of instinct, a dance where neither force is completely eliminated. Nietzsche saw the great moments of culture, like Greek tragedy, as expressions of this creative tension. In tragedy, suffering and pleasure, order and rupture coexist, revealing the beauty of life in all its complexity. Likewise, the creation of an authentic existence requires accepting that we are made of contrasts and paradoxes. This acceptance is not passive. It is an active practice of inner listening, the courage to not suppress parts of ourselves in the name of normality. It is recognizing that both our ability to think and our deepest impulses have something essential to offer. Denying instinct in the name of reason leads to rigidity and resentment. Denying reason in the name of instinct dissolves into chaos. To live fully is to keep the taut thread between Apollo and Dionysus, creating one's life as a living work of art, made of light and shadow, logic and passion. Nietzsche challenges us to see that inner struggle is not a flaw to be fixed, but the source of our vitality and uniqueness. Ultimately, we are the creative result of this conflict. And you, when have you felt it was necessary to balance reason and instinct to truly be yourself? For Eckhart Tolle, the key to finding the true self is not in grand projects or future pursuits, but in what is within our reach right now, full awareness of the present moment. In his view, the realization of being happens when we let go of the mental narratives that tie us to the past or the future, and fully immerse ourselves in the unfolding moment before us. Tolle observes that much of human suffering comes from our identification with the mind, especially with the incessant stream of thoughts about what has already passed or what is yet to come. We are constantly revisiting old stories or anticipating events that may never happen, while the present slips silently through our fingers. This mental movement creates a false identity, built from memories, expectations, and fears. We create an illusory self made up of stories we endlessly reinforce, and by doing so, we disconnect from the only reality that truly exists, the now. Finding the true self, according to Tolle, requires a break from this pattern. It's necessary to silence the mental constructs and cultivate a living presence in the present moment. It is not a forced effort, but a conscious surrender, stepping out of the mind and into being. When we surrender to the now, we realize that being is not lost somewhere far away. It is pulsing here, in this moment. The breath, the feeling of the body, the pure perception of the surroundings. All of this reconnects us to who we are immediately, before any interpretation. This awareness of the moment reveals a dimension of peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances. Even amidst challenges, it's possible to access an inner space of serenity where the past no longer weighs and the future doesn't yet oppress. In this space, the true self manifests effortlessly, without masks. For Tolle, fully living in the now is to abandon psychological time, the kind that carries guilt, anxiety, regret, or expectation, and dwell in real time, which is always new, always fresh, always free. The practice of presence is not an escape from the world, but a return to life in its most authentic and vibrant expression. And you, in what moments have you felt the transformative power of being fully present? Master Dogen, the great 13th century Zen master, teaches that the path to finding the true self is not in words, concepts, or endless mental analysis. The truth of the self is revealed through the practice of silence, when we quiet the incessant voices of the ego and allow reality to present itself as it is, free from judgments and distortions. For Dogen, the central practice is zazen, seated meditation in silence. But what matters is not just the external posture. It is the inner attitude of complete surrender to the present moment, in silence. Without seeking to achieve a goal or clinging to thoughts, the practitioner begins to dissolve the layer of noise that covers the direct experience of being. The ego, from Dogen's perspective, is this continuous voice that judges, compares, desires, and fears. It is a construct that feeds on separation. Me against the world, me against others, me against myself. As long as we are tangled in this narrative, we are distant from our true nature. Silence, however, is not the absence of sound, but the cessation of the compulsion to comment, analyze, and categorize everything. It is in the deep stillness of the mind that we can perceive reality before the intervention of the ego. A living, dynamic reality where there is no separation between subject and object. In this state, the self that arises is no longer the small self concerned with its image or achievements. It is the authentic being, one with the flow of life itself. There is nothing to be added or taken away, nothing to be conquered, just being with full presence and acceptance. Dogen insists that there is no need to look far or wait for a future enlightenment. The practice of silence itself is the realization, when done with genuine surrender, with every conscious breath, with every moment of non-judgment, we are closer to our true essence. Finding the self, then, is not about creating a new spiritual or improved identity. It is about seeing, with radical simplicity, that we have always been an inseparable part of the greater reality. Silence reveals this truth, not because it brings easy answers, but because it dissolves the illusory questions the ego invents. Ralph Waldo Emerson, a great thinker of American transcendentalism, invites us to a lesson that is as liberating as it is challenging. The true self can only flourish when we abandon the need for social recognition. As long as we remain attached to others' approval, we will live in the shadow of their expectations, far from our true essence. For Emerson, society, in many ways, is a leveling force. It values conformity, rewards those who adapt, and often punishes those who dare to be different. From an early age, we are trained to seek approval in school, at work, and in social circles. Because of this, authenticity becomes a risk, and the fear of rejection an invisible prison. The thinker warns us, the one who lives to please others loses themselves. Every time we shape our actions, words, or dreams to fit what others expect of us, we sacrifice a piece of our uniqueness. The need for recognition turns us into diluted versions of ourselves, shaped not by our inner truth, but by external demands. Detaching from this recognition, however, does not mean adopting an arrogant or indifferent stance. It is an inner liberation, acting in accordance with what the deepest conscience indicates is true, even if it doesn't bring applause, even if it provokes discomfort. Emerson proposes the courage of self-trust, not as empty pride, but as silent fidelity to one's own inner voice. He encourages us to trust that within each of us lies a spark of wisdom, capable of guiding our choices without needing constant validation from others. This detachment opens up an extraordinary space, the space of authentic creation. When we stop acting to please others, we can create, love, work, and live with more integrity and passion. We can discover dormant talents, personal values, and build a life that is truly our own. Living without relying on external approval also means accepting the loneliness that sometimes accompanies authenticity. Not everyone will immediately understand who we are, and that's okay. Emerson reminds us that originality is often, at first, uncomfortable for society. But it is originality that makes the soul grow and culture renew itself. Epictetus, one of the great masters of Stoicism, teaches us that true freedom does not depend on what happens outside of us, but on what happens within. For him, self-knowledge is the key to inner freedom. We can only truly be free if we know and control our own thoughts, emotions, and impulses. In his philosophy, Epictetus states that there are things within our control, our opinions, our desires, our actions, and things outside of our control, health, wealth, the opinions of others, external events. Wisdom begins exactly with distinguishing between these two spheres, and the first step toward this wisdom is to look within and understand the mind. For Epictetus, self-knowledge is a daily and rigorous practice. It's not enough to have good intentions or repeat lofty ideas. We must closely observe how we think, how we react, where we let ourselves be carried away by unchecked passions or unfounded fears. Above all, we must question the automatic beliefs that govern our behavior. Without this clear view of ourselves, we are like slaves to our emotions and circumstances. We react impulsively, seek outside what can only be found within, and get frustrated when the world doesn't meet our expectations. The lack of self-knowledge makes us vulnerable to external disturbances and keeps us trapped in an illusion of control. In contrast, when we deeply understand our own internal mechanisms, we gain power over them. We stop being dragged by the waves of the moment and begin to navigate our lives with more steadiness and serenity. Not because the world has changed, but because our relationship with it has transformed. Epictetus does not promise a life without pain or challenges, but he offers something even more valuable: the possibility of unwavering inner freedom, an autonomy that no loss, criticism, or adversity can destroy. And this freedom is only possible through disciplined self-knowledge. To know oneself is also to know one's limits, accept one's vulnerability, recognize the illusions, and from there, cultivate a stronger, wiser, and freer mind. Michel de Montaigne, a pioneer of modern essays, offers a view of human beings that resists any idea of fixity. The true self is not something finished and complete, but a continuous process of reflection and self-revision. For him, self-knowledge is, above all, questioning oneself, tirelessly, honestly, without comfortable illusions. In his essays, Montaigne delves into various topics, always starting from his own experience to reflect on the human condition. He doesn't provide definitive answers, because he understands that human beings are dynamic, changeable, subject to the fluctuations of time, health, emotions, and circumstances. Who we are today is not necessarily who we will be tomorrow. This perspective leads to the vital need for constant self-questioning. It's not about searching for a fixed essence, but engaging in a permanent dialogue with oneself, in which we examine our thoughts, our attitudes, our values, with courage and openness. For Montaigne, living without this questioning is to fall into rigidity, self-deception, and falseness. Self-knowledge, therefore, is an infinite task. Every new situation, every crisis, every unexpected joy reveals aspects of ourselves that we didn't know before. Being true to oneself isn't about maintaining a fixed image, but being willing to revise, correct, and reinvent oneself when necessary. Montaigne also teaches us to be wary of absolute certainties. Doubt, far from being a weakness, is a sign of intellectual and emotional maturity. Constant self-questioning prevents us from becoming prisoners of internal dogmas, of frozen truths that over time become invisible prisons. This practice is not an invitation to paralyzing uncertainty, but to active humility, recognizing that we are living processes and that growing requires the willingness to see oneself in a new light, to welcome change and not fear revision. In today's world, where we are often pressured to be sure about who we are and what we want, Montaigne's teaching comes as a breath of freedom. It is legitimate and necessary to change, mature, contradict oneself, and start over. The true self, for Montaigne, is one that is built and rebuilt in the sincerity of inner dialogue, in the courageous act of asking, "Who am I now?" And you, what questions do you feel have most challenged you in your process of self-knowledge? Leave your comment. Let's reflect together on the beauty of being works in eternal progress. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If these reflections have touched something inside you and inspired you to look deeper and with more courage at yourself, then you're on the right path to transformation. Don't forget to like the video. It really helps us share these messages with even more people who are also looking to grow and get to know themselves better. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content. There are many more videos that will help you dive deeper into this journey of self-knowledge and philosophy of life. Stay here, explore our other videos, and allow yourself to dive even deeper into this journey of reconnecting with your true self. See you in the next video.